Hello, I'm Dr. Beth Goethe.
And I'm Dr. Marthe Leatherman. We're here today to talk to you about sexual issues affecting persons who are aging and persons with dementia. This is the first of two 20-minute segments on this topic, and both segments can be found on www.mmlearn.org. And you see that on the slide there. The second segment builds on information that we're providing here in the first segment. So we'd like for you to try to watch them in order, but if you can't, that's okay. And you have to know that you don't have to watch them all at one sitting. They should be manageable pieces for you. At the end of the segment, we'll have a chance to show you a scenario about how we work with difficult sexual issues, sometimes affecting people with dementia. Beth, do patients and families ever ask you about sex?
Well, yes, they do. But you know, before we get into that part, maybe we ought to talk about why this is so difficult for people to handle, because it's such an uncomfortable and can be very embarrassing. We're not here to change your level of sensitivity to this issue, but we are here to educate you about how dementia affects sexual behavior, certainly, so that you can deal with things that are embarrassing and uncomfortable. It won't do us any good just to tell you, oh, sex is natural and everyone does it and you needn't worry about it. Because you have to understand why this is so peculiar. And then, even if you are uncomfortable or embarrassed in a situation, you will be able to cope with it.
And you know, an analogy might be helpful in the situation. At some point, if you're caring for somebody with dementia or failing physical abilities, that person might have become incontinent. You were probably uncomfortable, and if the incontinence involved bowel incontinence, even a little bit disgusted, because urinating or having a bowel movement in public is just not something that we're used to dealing with. It's when the private becomes public that it's very difficult. But over time, you understood that this new problem was part of a dementia or failing physical abilities, and so you were able to cope with it and work with it naturally as part of the process of the dementia.
And it's sort of the same thing with sexual behaviors. It's the public aspect of those that really adds another level of difficulty. Usually something that's thought of as private, we wonder, why does something like that that's so personal become public? And you're probably asking, why is it important for me to understand why this happened?
Well, one reason is that because you want to be able to separate your feelings for your loved one from the behavior that is the dementia, so that these uncomfortable and sometimes embarrassing behaviors don't define the person that you love, and you can recognize them as the dementia separate from your loved one.
The other thing is that it's true that behavior problems need to be managed immediately, and anybody can give you tips to handle certain behaviors. But what we want you to do is understand the cause of why these behaviors occur in public and what you can do about them. Because the more you understand, the more in control you're going to feel of the situation, even though you're embarrassed and uncomfortable, so that you can handle the situation better. So we've been talking a lot about this. What are the reasons that the private behaviors then become public? Well, on the slide you can see that one of the first things is the circumstances in which the person lives. Then there are memory and perceptual changes that occur due to the dementia, and then frontal lobe problems. Now, in this segment, we're going to talk about the circumstances in which a person lives, how that changes the private to the public. And then in the next segment, we'll talk about the other two.
Well, what are the circumstances in which a person lives that cause a lack of privacy? The situations in which people live. For example, if somebody is in a nursing home or an assisted living facility or in the hospital, it can cause things that we think of as private, the things that we do in our own home behind closed doors, to become public. Most obviously, if there is a roommate situation, it's very difficult to have any privacy if caregivers are coming in and out to care for a roommate. Or if a husband and wife are not able to live together in the same room. Less obvious but very common is the situation in which staff members must be able to come in to provide care. Even if you have a private room, there are times that people have to be able to come in and care for you. The staff have to be able to get in sometimes with a key, because if there's been an accident or if somebody needs help and can't get to the door to open the door, the staff member has to be able to come in. Also, staff who are not even healthcare professionals, such as housekeepers or repair people, or people from outside of the facility, such as lab technicians who have to come in and draw blood, need to have access. So sometimes it's true that people come in without knocking or announcing themselves, but you can still see how maintaining access to the person being cared for is very important. And as frustrating as it can be when people don't always knock, if you can think of it from the worker's point of view, they work there all the time. And you know how at your own work you might decorate your office or think of your cubicle as your space. It's sort of a natural tendency. It doesn't mean it's right, and it doesn't mean that you shouldn't draw that to people's attention, but a level of understanding can be very helpful.
Exactly right, Martha. You know, even if somebody is in their own home, just the presence of nurses or therapists, like a physical therapist, or other kinds of home caregivers, a housekeeper even, can reduce their privacy. And you know, caregivers really try hard to maintain that privacy and yet maintain access to the person. They have to have access to take care of them. And you know, as a caregiver, if you're taking care of someone in your home, your loved one in your home, you know how hard it is to maintain their privacy and yet maintain access to them. For instance, you may want to be sure they're okay or check on them to see if they need anything, even if they've been in a room alone for a period of time. So you need to be able to go in and out of that room and check on them. So regardless of whether someone is in a facility or in their own home, they need private time or a level of privacy that everyone respects.
But how do you do that? I mean, we've just said that you have to have access in some situations, and we know that not all of you are in the same circumstance, which is why tips don't work. If we give an adult caregiver who's the child of elderly parents a tip, that's not necessarily going to work for the spouse of someone who has dementia and the spouse who's a caregiver. But let's think through a couple of situations, and you can use the knowledge that you're going to gain from thinking through these situations to apply to your own specific situation. Let's say you're helping to take care of your parents at home, and one of your parents has dementia. This is your parents' home, and you have to come in and out to give them care. You know that they might want alone time together. You know that they, in the past, have always been sexually active, and they've loved each other and been devoted to each other. So the first thing that you can do is probably the simplest. Knock and ask if it's okay to come in. Again, we forget the simplest things sometimes.
We do.
The other thing that you can do is ask questions about the need for privacy. Questions that don't have to be intrusive, such as, you know, Mom, are there times that you and Dad would prefer to be alone or would prefer not to have visitors? Do you need alone time? How can I help you make sure that you have the alone time? And are there things that I can communicate to other caregivers, such as physical therapists or home aides, that will help maintain that alone time? What do you want me to do if I think there's an emergency? You know, where are those boundaries?
That's an important question. It really is, because you have to know what to do in certain situations.
So in this way, you can have a conversation with your parent that gives him or her control over the situation, yet still opens those doors to real communication about what they need.
Right. You know, right now we're talking about appropriate sexual behaviors in private. We will be talking about inappropriate sexual behaviors later on. But right now we're just addressing this issue of privacy and the circumstances that people live. Now, what about privacy and private time when you're in a facility? Let's think about that for a minute. You know, one of the things that might happen is that everybody agrees that, between 2 and 3 in the afternoon on Tuesdays and Thursdays is the resident's private time. And everybody agrees to that. Now, what happens if the call button is pressed? It could be an accident, could have been rolled over on and pressed, but what if it isn't an accident? And what do the nurses do when the call button goes off, but they're not supposed to enter the resident's room during that private time? This is where tips don't really work. This is a situation where you really need to negotiate for your particular situation. For instance, you might agree with the staff that if you're a spouse and you're coming to visit your husband or wife in the nursing home or assisted living, and you want that private time, you can agree with them that you'll be responsible for their care during that time. And then you have to figure out ways around that if something does happen. Like, okay, I'll leave the room and come get you if I need anything, or I'll at least open the door and ring the call button so you know it's okay to come in. You know, even something simple like telling you, well, just pretend it's like a hotel where you put up the do not disturb sign so you don't want the maid to come in. That's a great tip, but you know what? You better remove that sign when you leave.
That's right.
And we're not trying to be sarcastic or funny here, because you've made a pact with the staff that they can trust you so that they know and you know what the situation is and what the rules are. So if you leave and leave the sign on the door, you're putting them in a position of not being able to take care of your loved one because you inadvertently left the sign on the door. So you really don't want to do that. In terms of putting signs on doors and that sort of thing, you really need to think of this as a way to plan ahead.
Right. The more you plan ahead, the more control you have over the situation, and that's when it becomes difficult, is when everything is a surprise and becomes an emergency.
And even though you're uncomfortable, and we'll be revisiting this theme throughout this, even though you're uncomfortable thinking about this or planning ahead for all sorts of things that could happen, the more you plan ahead, the more control everybody's going to feel, and then the likelihood of those embarrassing situations coming up is much reduced.
Now, you need to understand that different facilities, different care homes, different residences might have different regulations. But this is something that you could and should and can talk about with the administration and with the nursing staff. And we're not promising that it's always going to work out the way that we're suggesting here, but the dialogue really has to happen, and that way you can work out something that's workable for everybody. But what if you walk into the nursing home that your parent lives in, and you're met by a member of the staff who says, there's a problem with your mom or dad or husband or wife. Yesterday he was undressed from the waist down, or nude, or inappropriate, or something very private.
Whatever term they use.
That's now made public and is extremely embarrassing. Now this is where the public is made private because it's being I said that backwards. The private is being made public because it's being discussed. The first thing you have to do is separate the behavior from the embarrassment that you feel because it's being discussed. And you have to know that the staff are not intentionally trying to embarrass you. They are not deriving some kind of vicarious pleasure from talking about this. They have to talk to you about it because it has to do with regulations that they have to follow.
That's right. You know, you need to recognize that staff and administrators of these facilities, because of state and or federal regulations
and lawsuits,
have to report behaviors. Things like falls, a change in a medical condition or an emergency, they have to report those things, and it protects them and protects you and your loved one. Likewise, they have to report certain sexual behaviors. Now think about this for a minute. If they're trying to provide care, let's say go in and give medications or serve food, they need to, and if they see something that they think is an inappropriate sexual behavior, they're not sure even, or they may be sure, they have to protect themselves and the other residents as well as your loved one. You know, facilities are in a precarious position these days. They're supposed to be a home, and they're supposed to be like home, except that they're places of employment, and they have to protect their employees as well as their loved ones. You know, there's equal opportunity commission rules, there are employee rights, and so they have to abide by that. So the staff report incidents because they are professionals, and they do it in a professional way.
And it's better to report the incident and sort it out than not report it and have it be a real problem.
That's right.
For example, your loved one may exhibit a behavior that was not sexual, but another resident with dementia may misinterpret the behavior or believe it was sexual and then feel threatened. That person may retaliate by striking out at your loved one. So reporting the behaviors and figuring out what happened actually protects your loved one as well as the other residents and staff. Now that we've been able to look at the report of the behavior without being mortified and wanting to hide your head and run away, you're in a better position to start asking questions. You first ask exactly what was the behavior. If you were told he was touching himself, was that actually masturbation, or could it have been misinterpreted? Could he have a rash or a urinary tract infection or some medical condition that needed to be addressed? If it becomes clear that the behavior was masturbation, then the next thing to ask is, even though we're all very uncomfortable with that topic, discussing it in public, where did the behavior occur? Was it in his room? Was it private? Was it something that somebody inadvertently walked into? Because masturbation is not wrong. It's not against the regulations of the facility. It's not against the law. It's only wrong if it's in an appropriate position.
That's right. And by asking questions, even if you're uncomfortable, you can start a dialogue and work together so that in this situation, your father would have private time and then reduce those embarrassing situations of the staff walking in on him. So now you see how you can manage the behavior rather than respond immediately to your discomfort. This happens to Marthe and me a lot when we go into facilities where a new behavior or a change of behavior or a sexual behavior possibly is reported to us when we walk in the door.
So let's role play that a little bit. Dr. Goethe is going to be her professional self and come into the facility, and I'm going to be a staff member who is reporting a behavior. Dr. Goethe, Mr. Jones was undressed and touching himself today.
Now, tell me a little bit more about that. Where did this happen?
Well, I'm not sure. It was just told to me by the CNA who came out of his room and was very embarrassed.
Now, what time did that happen? Was it the morning CNA, or is it the one that's on duty now?
I'll have to look. I think it was the morning because it was the night shift going off.
Well, you know, let's talk with her to find out exactly what happened, and that way we can maybe solve the problem.
Well, she's still here, so we can do that. I'll go get her, and we'll ask, and I'll ask her about that. So I might come back with some information or look at the logbook and be able to tell Dr. Goethe, well, it was in his bathroom, and it was about 7:30 this morning, and he had his pants down and was fondling and groping at his penis.
Did he have an erection, or was he just scratching? Could she tell?
Well, she thought he was masturbating. He apparently was not erect, but she thought he was masturbating.
Okay. Well, let's talk about this for a minute, and then it could be that when I go in to talk to him, maybe we can figure something out and see what was going on. Now, you see, I might have been really uncomfortable with that, but at least we were talking and already kind of trying to problem solve and gather information.
And I can tell you that from my experience taking care of hundreds and hundreds of people with dementia, it is as likely as not that behavior that's seen as sexual really has some medical cause, either a rash or discomfort or a urinary tract infection.
Right.
But that's not necessarily always the case. Sometimes there truly are very inappropriate sexual behaviors, and we'll talk about those in the next segment.
Please join us.
Thank you.